and gentlemen. I returned last week from a meeting in Copenhagen with ministers of defense from 14 nations to coordinate our political way ahead in the Defeat ISIS campaign. Chairman Dunford returned yesterday from a Chief of Defense meeting in Brussels with 28 NATO nations, plus his counterparts from a dozen additional nations, and they discussed the military aspects of that campaign. Mr. McGurk, President Trump's special envoy and vital State Department leader to the coalition to counter ISIS, returned a few hours ago from his trip to Syria, Iraq, and Jordan. This is our first opportunity to get together, and we took advantage of that for this conference. So today's a good time to update you, describing basically where we're at, what has changed, and the way ahead. President Trump directed the Department of Defense to lead in a comprehensive review of the campaign. We submitted that report, and after his review, he then ordered an accelerated operation against ISIS. So what does that mean? Two significant changes resulted from President Trump's review of our findings. First, he delegated authority to the right level to aggressively and in a timely manner move against enemy vulnerabilities. Secondly, he directed a tactical shift from shoving ISIS out of seized locations in an attrition fight to surrounding the enemy and their strongholds so we can annihilate ISIS. The intent is to prevent the return home of escaped foreign fighters. I want to emphasize here there has been no change to our rules of engagement, and there has been no change to our continued extraordinary efforts to avoid innocent civilian casualties. Despite needing to go into populated areas to break ISIS' hold on their self-described caliphate, despite ISIS purposely endangering innocent lives by refusing to allow civilians to evacuate, and we continue all possible efforts to protect the innocent. You're all aware of the human costs ISIS has exacted: killed, wounded, refugees, merciless control over those regions they hold, the costs to Turkey, Jordan, and Lebanon as Syrians and Iraqis have been displaced. In response to ISIS' malicious and unforgivable treatment toward innocents, the world has responded. I emphasize that this is a coalition effort. Since this began in 2014, the coalition has strengthened and expanded. The international team is fully committed at the political and military levels to the destruction of ISIS. A coalition of 68 members, 65 nations, with more joining as we speak, Paul, the European Union, and Arab League united in opposition, sharing intelligence, providing troops and funds for combat, and of no less importance, for the post-combat recovery. In late March, our Secretary of State gathered diplomatic colleagues in Washington where they discussed how we would deal with the post-combat aftermath. Secretary Tillerson, Mr. McGurk, and their colleagues in the coalition rightly focus most of their effort on how this ravaged region can recover from ISIS depredations after we free it. 26 of our coalition nations contribute militarily, including more than 4,000 non-U.S. troops in the ground and in the air. Our recent coalition meetings in Brussels, Copenhagen, and elsewhere reflect an energized campaign among contributing nations. Partnering with, of course, the Iraqi security forces in Iraq and the counter-ISIS forces in Syria. So what have we achieved? We have fought ISIS elements from Southeast Asia to Africa. Collaboration among many nations, intelligence services continues to complicate and blunt ISIS operations, even as ISIS continues to pursue and conduct attacks against the United States and our allies through centralized, directed plots, but also through inspired attacks. From the Philippines to Europe and beyond, while ISIS remains dangerous, they are no longer carrying an air of strength. In Afghanistan 2 weeks ago, President Ghani announced we had killed the leader of ISIS Khorasan, plus approximately 2/3 of their strength been killed during very tough operations, mostly in Nangarhar province. France has brilliantly led a 2-year ongoing campaign in the Lake Chad Basin and West Africa to throw ISIS off balance. Their troops on the ground to support our African allies. In Libya, we struck a significant ISIS presence there in January of this year. Our attack against their concentrated strength was highly effective, and ISIS did not own any major territory any longer there. Elsewhere, too, there have been successes. But in Iraq and Syria lies the core area of ISIS, of its geographic caliphate. Recent attacks in Istanbul, Paris, and Brussels were planned and coordinated out of ISIS' so-called capital of Raqqa. Additional imminent threats to many nations require us to move with urgency against all strongholds still in their hands. East Mosul, as you know, has fallen after tough fighting by the Iraqi security forces with U.S. and coalition support. Since January, it is returning to normal with businesses reopening, cleanup underway, and kids back in school. West Mosul, in accordance with tactics changed by President Trump, is surrounded, and our Iraqi partners are in a stiff fight. There is no escape for ISIS, even while we do all that is humanly possible to shepherd the innocent out of harm's way. Tal Afar, which lies to the west of Mosul, is also surrounded, and other pockets of ISIS exist elsewhere in Nineveh, Hawija, and the western Euphrates River Valley of Anbar province. We will continue to fully support the Iraqi security forces and Prime Minister Abadi's government in isolating and destroying ISIS throughout Iraq. In Syria, we support Syrian democratic forces that recently seized Manbij, have taken Tabqa, and are currently attacking with great success to isolate Raqqa. ISIS has additional strength scattered down the Euphrates River Valley to the Iraq border. We will not stop until they, too, are destroyed. I want our Chairman, General Dunford, and our President's Special Envoy, Mr. McGurk, to provide more details, so let me sum up. We are leading a comprehensive international campaign to crush ISIS' claim of invincibility, to deny ISIS a geographic haven from which to hatch murder, eliminate ISIS' ability to operate externally, and eradicate their ability to recruit and finance terrorist operations. Thanks to the leadership and authorities granted by President Trump, thanks to the spirit of dozens of nations committed to this fight, thanks to the nations whose troops have gone toe-to-toe with this terrorist group, with the deepest sympathy for the families that have lost sons and daughters in this fight, and with the greatest respect for the families caught up on the battlefields that we note are also humanitarian fields, we have retaken over 55% of ISIS territory there in the core. Over 4 million people have been liberated, and not 1 inch of territory seized from ISIS has been recaptured from them, recaptured by them. Now let me turn it over to Chairman Dunford and Mr. McGurk for more specifics on our Defeat ISIS campaign. Chairman.